Welcome to National Security Law Today, the podcast of the Standing Committee on Law and National Security. I'm Elisa. I'm always here in my individual capacity. We're going to continue on the topic of artificial intelligence this week, but this time we're going to turn to a discussion that you've all been asking us to have, which is the use of AI in military targeting. Now, since 2001, the United States has lost 2,465 troops. We say troops, but what that means is human beings. In Afghanistan alone, and we've seen over 20,000 wounded. More than 30,000 former troops have committed suicide since they fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And at least one of these 20-plus years-long wars was originally styled Operation Swift Freedom. I say that without any irony today. So at some point early on, it became apparent to people in the Pentagon that we needed a different approach to ground troops, something more effective and targeted. But what? And who were our enemies or competitors, and what were they developing in the land of math that might leave us at a military disadvantage? Now, in charge of defining and developing that answer was, I'm sure, many people, but one of them was Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, who was the inaugural director of the U.S. Department of Defense Joint Artificial Center, JAIC. But while he was there, he led efforts to integrate AI across the defense enterprise. And as the founding director of algorithmic warfare's cross-functional team, they always have to put cross-functional in there somewhere. It was called Project Maven. And there's a very fast-selling book out there by a wonderful journalist on this topic right now, but we thought we'd go right to the source. Jack pioneered the DoD's first operational AI program, advancing the use of AI for military operations and intelligence collection and analysis. And that should give you a hint that it didn't exactly start just with targeting. Hey, Jack, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much. I look forward to our conversation.
I do too. So how did this, I look at all the loss of wars, and I guess as a mom, I'm horrified. Tell me this, though. When I go into the Pentagon, first of all, I can't find anything. It's frightening. There are so many people who work there. I mean, if you need a cup of coffee, you're in trouble. But tell us, in this behemoth that is the Department of Defense, what was the original intent behind this AI program?
So it starts with Project Maven, and then I end up leading the Joint AI Center, and we can talk about the differences between the two because they were two different organizations. But the whole point of Project Maven, I go back to a sort of an oxymoron, which is catastrophic success. We were having Intel analysts look at screens of information, mostly full motion video from drones, whatever the official term that the military likes to use, they were drones, and Intel analysts would stare at screens for 10 hours, 11 hours at a time. But it wasn't all they were asked to do. They were asked to pull in sources of intelligence and information from everywhere, from the most exquisite classified satellites to social media open source. You run out of hours in the day. And we knew that over time, this was all beginning in the Middle East. We could see the future of where we would start pulling people out of the Middle East. Ironic though it may be, we are back putting people in the Middle East. But at the time, the focus was beginning to shift to the Indo-Pacific. So we had more collection from more sources than at any point in a literal sense, than at any point in history. And the humans were overwhelmed with looking at the information. So a Marine Corps colonel, who you mentioned the book by Katrina Manson, gets into this in a lot of detail about Colonel Drew Kukor, gave him this project and say, go figure out, is there a way we can solve this? We didn't want a slight change. We wanted to find something that would transform how intelligence analysts did their job. They did not find anything in the Department of Defense research laboratories. I love the research laboratories in the military, the Air Force Research Lab, Army, and so on. They're fantastic, great people. Everything they were doing was very research deep, not ready to be fielded to the warfighter in anything under a couple of years. So the Marine Corps colonel and his number two, Joe Larson, who's a Stanford lawyer, educated lawyer, together went out to Silicon Valley and almost overnight found capabilities in startup companies saying, we think we have a way to help you. We put a little pilot project together, demonstrated to the then number 2 in the department, a gentleman by the name of Bob Work, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And he almost on the spot, about 24 hours later, signed out a memo standing up Project Maven. Now, to get to what we were really trying to do, everything I described, I'll summarize it by saying 3 different things that begin with the letter A: to augment the humans, to make their life better, to accelerate their workflows, which were extremely manual, laborious, cutting and pasting from Excel, PowerPoint, Word into documents and sending the documents up for review. And by the time anybody senior saw them, they were basically obsolete. And then the third A was automate. We were very careful not to overemphasize automate in those early days because we weren't ready for it. The technology was that advanced. There were some people who were concerned that we were going to take their job away as Intel analysts. My answer to them was consistent. I need more of you, not fewer of you. What we're trying to do is allow you to do your job better and to be able to use more of these resources at your disposal to make you more effective first and foremost, but also to increase efficiency. Efficiency was secondary. I'll be very clear. This was about effectiveness on the Intel analyst side. So we started with small projects, identifying people, identifying buildings, identifying vehicles. And slowly over time, we got more and more sophisticated, daytime, nighttime, adult, child, weapon, no weapon, and just started to prove out, was this going to work? We had a lot of false starts. We made mistakes. But in the end, we saw enough promise in all of that that then I was asked to stand up this other organization called the Joint AI Center, or the JAIC, to take on everything that Project Maven was not doing. Project Maven was about intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It was about the Intel enterprise. In JAIC, we took on everything else, everything from predictive maintenance on helicopters to, you mentioned earlier, the stunning statistic in a horrible way of suicides. One of our projects was trying to come up with enough data to start looking at potential indications of suicidal tendency. It's a very hard problem to solve, but there actually is a lot of data in the military out there. Then we had humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, tracking wildfires and flood damage and all these other things. So Project Maven was sort of the AI Big Bang for the department, is the way I like to call it. And the Joint AI Center was taking on everything else beyond what Maven continued to work on.
So tell me, was there something, some triggering event that motivated this in the first place? Or was it Jack Shanahan's looking around and saying, just can't we do better?
It's a combination of both. I ran something at a very senior level, a sort of general and admiral level senior executive service on the civilian side, where we would look at, it's a term that very few people will understand, and the people listening to this, but called processing, exploitation, and dissemination. It's how you deal with the Intel community, how you deal with all this information. So we all agreed at that level that it was unsustainable the way it was going. So that was partly the motivation. The other motivation, which, to be clear, that Katrina Mansa brings out very well in her book, is the Marine Corps colonel had been in combat in various places and said, why in the world are we allowing our people to use this outdated technology? It is getting people killed. There must be something better out there. What can we do to make sure nobody has to go through what him and many others, by the way, everybody on that Maven team, almost to a person, had been in combat and it's seen kind of the archaic technology we were dealing with. And this is life and death stuff. So if you're looking at drone video, we call them unmanned. They're not unmanned whatsoever. There's a pilot, a sensor operator, there's a whole intelligence team, and there's a whole maintenance team that nobody ever talks about, but they're as important to all this story as anybody else. But the intelligence analysts are working with the pilot and sensor operators. Some of this is very real-time intelligence. So you can imagine an Intel analyst looking at a screen for 5 hours and nothing happens in that 5 hours. And then for 2 minutes and 30 seconds, absolute storm breaks out, like heat of the battle. Someone is going to die unless we take action right now. The idea of having to do all that manually without the assistance of some of these AI capabilities was ludicrous. You actually had to get this technology in the hand. And as we found out, no surprise to any of us, like we would be the first to say, innovation does not happen in the Pentagon. Our job was to push the technology down to that tactical level, to the warfighter level, to the intel analyst, and let them figure out how to use it in the best way possible. Our job is to be as agile as possible, is updating those systems, working with these commercial tech companies side by side in a very close relationship to make it better and better for the end user. That's what it was all about. So it was a combination of pushing from below, pushing from above, and in the middle, really understanding that this was a chance. The vision we had, I know this is going to sound a little bit pie in the sky, but it's important. We shared a vision of changing the way the military did things for the next 25 years. Did it happen overnight? Of course not. But the day we all walk in the door and say, today we're going to make a difference for the warfighter, for the intel analyst, that was a powerful combination of a team of people who were committed to doing this.
You mentioned the role of Silicon Valley in this. And what I found interesting was I had recently read over some of the comments by Eisenhower on what he called public-private partnerships. The government didn't have the skills necessary when it came to new technology to really help defend the United States in the best possible way. So echoes of sort of that moment in the Cold War when we were also, I guess, shifting the way we perceived how the government needed to do business. So it sounds like you reached that point where you recognized something had to happen and you sent Kukar to use the best and the brightest in America to achieve that goal. And it would be pretty hard to argue that we don't have the best and the brightest in the world.
Yeah, but what makes this different? This to this day, this cultural difference is palpable in a way with what we saw go on between Anthropic and the Department of Defense. But in the sort of Eisenhower days, it was what we would call a defense industrial base. Eventually, what Eisenhower called it in sort of one of his big addresses was the military industrial congressional complex. But it really was the traditional defense companies, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, the Raytheons, building the traditional military things. And all of a sudden, we found out there's these technologies being built by commercial companies for commercial reasons. I could spend a long time giving you my theories about the end of the Cold War brought this sort of technological libertarianism out in the West Coast, where the government was not paying attention to these companies because the companies no longer viewed the government as their customer. The commercial consumer was the customer. That's where the money was coming from. They didn't care about the government money because it was a pittance to what Steve Jobs was making with Apple, and you can name all the other companies. So they sort of were left alone for over 20 to 25 years. And all of a sudden, the department was being criticized by really important tech people saying, you have missed the revolution that's occurring on the outside. You must go look into this and bring these technologies into the government. That was foreign to the Pentagon at the time. I'll be honest with you. The philosophy we took, which gets directly what you're saying, was a commercial first philosophy. You did not have 100 PhDs coming out of MIT, Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, sitting there building things for the government. We had to go out and talk with them and saying, do you think you could help us with this? And sure enough, they could. But it was, in some cases, as we found out with Google and Project Maven, a strained relationship. Not at the executive level, not at the C-suite level, but at the worker level, there were some really deep concerns by workers about working with the Department of Defense on drone technology. That was viewed in a very serious way by people. No matter what we tried to convince them of, this wasn't targeting. Their answer was, well, you can get to targeting from there, so we consider it targeting. So we learned a lot during that process. I thought we were through it all, but I don't think we are. I think we're seeing some of these same tensions play out today with some of these companies and the department.
Where were we, though, in terms of the drone wars when this started? Because people imagine, we're just firing these drones and the operators are sitting somewhere, maybe in, the Pentagon, maybe in Nevada, wherever they might be. And somehow they're not affected by targeting. But then we learned that, yes, indeed, they are. They're experiencing PTSD. They are affected deeply by this. They have concerns. And obviously, one of the biggest concerns would be accuracy and avoidance of civilian targets. So when this started, what did that look like?
First of all, at one point when I had a command down in San Antonio, this was right before I came to the Pentagon and started the whole Project Maven thing. I had responsibility for the entire United States Air Force enterprise, the ISR enterprise, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And I'll admit it, I was a little skeptical about the idea of people doing that intel analysis from, say, 4,000 miles away were affected mentally by what they were seeing. Wow, was I wrong? There's no other way I can make the point that going in and talking to the people that were watching some, remember, this is the counter ISIS by Al Qaeda, watching some of the most horrific things that one human being can do to another human being, and having to come in the next day and see it again and see it again. They were deeply affected. I just disagree so strongly with people say, well, remote warfare, it's different than being on the ground. The idea of being killed, yes, is entirely differently. As a soldier on the ground, you risk being killed. But this idea of the mental trauma is real. I saw it. It affected people. What could we give them to tools to help with that as well? And then just in general, we were putting more of these drones up than ever before. I mean, every day we had 30, 40, sometimes 50 of these orbits going on. It was just an overwhelming amount of information. And that's where we were at the time. But it was also counterterrorism, counterinsurgency sort of fight, where all of a sudden what we're seeing play out in Iran today is more traditional, conventional military against military, although you make the case that Iran is playing a game of asymmetry rather than symmetry. But at the time, this really was about counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and there was just too much information for the humans to deal with.
I get that. Let me ask you this. The counterterrorism efforts that you're describing, I mean, they're obviously topographically sort of challenging. How would you describe those as informing what you did next with respect to this effort in Maven and Jake, or however you pronounce it?
Yes, it's a lot of what we were doing. The command largely running a lot of those operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa with Special Operations Command. They were, without any question, the earliest adopters of Project Maven. One, because generally it accepts risk more than some of the other more traditional military organizations, but also the nature of the fight. It was a Special Operations Command fight. The Navy SEALs, the Rangers, Delta, all these other teams that were out there, we were there to try to help them figuring out this targeting picture. You said something earlier, I wanted to come back to it. One of the things we found that AI was extremely good at, and over time better and better, was this idea of forensics analysis. Let's just take a very basic example. A car bomb goes off in the middle of a village square in Afghanistan. In the old days, the manual process of trying to figure out where that vehicle had come from, if it could even be done, might have been weeks in the making. With AI, I'm not saying it was instantaneous, but we began to see signs that it could be done in a couple of hours of trace that vehicle. Where did it come from? And then from there, you start building out. You said it maybe in a slightly different phrase, but I'll use pattern of life analysis. What's going on? What is that human network? Who's talking to whom? Who's meeting with whom? And then we went from basic perception, like identifying things, to just beginning to bring in this idea of context. What are we seeing in this scene? Some of that you could work with AI to train it in a way to say, very basic at the time, if A, then B, or A and B equals C, you could start adding context. And I would suggest today, now with this idea of large language models, and especially these idea of very advanced frontier models, you're starting to see reasoning being added onto that. So perception to context to reasoning, and then the future is going to get very hard to understand in this world of agency. And maybe we get into that a little bit. But at the time, this really was about human network, building out the networks, understanding all the things that were going on in the battle space. And both the intel operator or the intel analyst and the human special operator could each look at almost the same screen, but they could make the screen look the way they each wanted it to look, tailored for their purposes. Very powerful. The same underlying Maven capabilities, but we started layering more and more information on top of it, and then you could make it look the way you wanted it to look based on your personal preferences. Powerful.
How did America's tech dominance and its standing against China, which I'll be candid, I think is really our big competitor. So how did this play in, if it did, to the need for this program to be launched, developed, improved, and continued?
I don't think anybody would be surprised to hear me say that US and China are the world's two AI superpowers. There are a lot of other countries with rapidly improving AI, but US and China are the two superpowers in AI, and they're following each other very closely. But back to those early days, and then even since I retired, it's kind of been the same story. My argument was always, here are the things we must use AI to do in the national security enterprise. There's a geopolitical component of it, there's geoeconomics piece of it, but here are the things that are important for us to do. Now, the fact that China is also trying to do the same thing in the military gives us even more urgency in what we're doing. So we were going to go down this path regardless, but the fact that we also had an adversary willing to do the same sense of urgency, take on similar projects, we could see enough to say they were very interested in Project Maven-like things. They followed what we were doing in the US very closely. They follow us today. We follow what they're doing. But it was, we need to do this. The fact that we have a potential adversary also moving quickly does really change the sense of urgency. There's no question about it. Now, I think it's also been used by an excuse by some people to throw the so-called China hot card, saying China, China, China. They're not 100 feet tall. They're not 2 feet tall. They have a lot of similar capabilities to the United States military. What matters more to me is stop focusing just on that tip of the iceberg piece of technology and really talk about how you're using it in the operational context. That is where one side will make a difference more than anything else. It's how you reorganize. It's how your warfighting concepts of operation change. It's how you integrate the technology across your entire joint forces. That has not been determined yet in this sort of continuous competition between the United States and China in AI.
This makes me wonder too, though, because we don't have AI without chips and they take critical minerals. And let me tell you, the critical minerals are, China's got them mostly locked down. Sometimes when you hear items in the news and they sound really harebrained and aspirational, sometimes I look beneath that, like, why on earth are we talking about taking Greenland? And then I start to think about the critical minerals. But I have to imagine that you would have been aware of that. And that's something that's on your mind. Like, how are we going to construct these chips? Where are we going to get these minerals when they're scooping them out of Myanmar and they've got them all over. And they have things that you need for your fighter jets that, like, I'll be honest, nobody else has.
They had us over a barrel on rare earths, and they still do to some extent. But it's funny you say this because I'll tell you, one of the early visits I made, got out to the West Coast, visited several of these companies we were working with. But I'll never forget going into this, I won't say little company, you'll know the name of it in just a second. We go in there, and I am so excited. We get in a partnership with them. We're going to buy. I mean, nobody in the military had 240 GPUs, these graphic processing units, and nobody in the military had that many. We had them for our special project that we were working with Google on. And that company was NVIDIA. And so I got to meet Jensen Huang out in Hawaii for a computer vision, which is a type of AI conference. And it was so exciting to be in that partnership back then. I had no idea that this is the world I'd be looking at today. It sort of felt like, hey, we got this close relationship with NVIDIA. Yeah, us in the department, we had a Defense Production Act memo signed, which is, I still don't know how Drew Kukor pulled that out, but we never had to use it. It basically said, hey, if there needs to be a prioritization call on graphics processing unit, Maven gets it. I never had to do it because it wasn't 100,000 GPUs. Back then it was 1,000 here, 1,500 there. The world exploded over the past couple of years. No way I could have ever seen that coming.
Let's talk about you mentioned NVIDIA, but early on, we hear a lot about Palantir. And unfortunately, as you've probably noticed, we're also hearing some of the things out of the mouths of the founders of Palantir that I think it might have been better if they'd never said. They're not too appealing. But talk to me about how you found these people, or how Drew, I guess, found these people, and how this all came to be.
Yeah, no, it really was a sort of a networking thing. So you had this organization on the West Coast called the Defense Innovation Unit. Back then, it was called Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, DIUX. One of their jobs was to service the bridge. It was a Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, had signed out this memo trying to stand up this whole innovation initiative. So they stood up, and part of their job was to help introduce Defense Department people to commercial tech people. So they played a little bit into this. There's also an organization or company, if you want to call it that, called In-Q-Tel, which you're probably familiar with, that works out of the CIA, does a similar to what a venture capital firm would do, but do it exclusively for companies that want to work in national security. So we also turned to them. But some of it was just who you knew, who you talked to. Hey, this company's doing this. I don't know how Drew did it. He was so tuned into all these different places that he would go sit down with the CEOs of a startup company and say, what do you got? I mean, our requirements were so simple back in those days, not this stack of Defense Department 400-page requirements. Is here's kind of what we need. What do you have? And some of those companies turned out to work with us. Some didn't have what we were looking for. We took money up to a certain milestone and said, you know what? It was good up to that point, but we don't think this is what we're really looking for. But it was all having to do with contracts and acquisition, but it worked, and it worked really well. And then I think probably the biggest surprise to people that really thought we were the junior league is Google. We put Google on contract for our wicked hard problem, this thing called a wide area motion imagery sensor on an MQ-9 drone. So that was a shock to people. Like Google had been saying, no, we don't do that kind of work. And all of a sudden, we had them on contract with it. But every one of these companies was sort of contract by contract. By the time I got into the Joint AI Center and the JAIC, we didn't have the time to do that. So we started putting in umbrella contracts and all these other acquisition, professionalization, and modernization initiatives to try to make it easier to do that. But it really was groundbreaking back then. And, data alone, individual data discussions with the company were contract by contract. I mentioned Joe Larson's name earlier. As a Stanford lawyer, he knew enough about these intellectual property protections to have these pretty sophisticated conversations, first with the startup tech companies who had never worked with the government before. So they were very confused. They thought they were going to get rich overnight. We dissuaded them from that notion pretty quickly. And then Google comes to the table armed with some of the best lawyers in the world. Those are a different kind of conversations. The Office of General Counsel in the department you're very familiar with. Back then, they did not have anybody who really understood AI. They finally brought a reservist in, an officer that had done some tech work in his civilian world, but also came in now as a military lawyer. That's when we began to understand how to put all these different pieces together, because the legal piece of this was front and center from day one. Everything from data protections to the ethics of using these technologies in targeting and in life and death.
There's a lot to unpack there. One of the first things is the data protections. The data could be poisoned. The data needs to be usable. And my understanding from listening to the Senate hearings on DoD data is that 80% of it isn't even usable. It's not anything that can be aggregated in such a way that it can feed a model and be helpful. And I imagine this is pretty precious data, and protections are important. And when you visit any of these companies out in Silicon Valley, one of the first big takeaways you might have is how utterly international they are.
Yes.
They have people from all over the world working there, the best talent. They don't necessarily have the vision of the United States that we might have in the national security space and, called to serve.
Yeah, a lot there. So I know you don't want me to use acronyms, so I'm going to use them, but I'll explain it right away because I made this one up. It doesn't exist. BFM and AFM. BFM is before frontier models. AFM is after frontier models. In those early days of Maven and the JAIC, we didn't have frontier models. They were just a thing in the research community. Back then, it was easier to deal with the data piece of it. So very quickly, what a company would do is build an algorithm, train it against their own data, turn that algorithm over to us. We would then use department data to turn it into a functional model. That's where the discussions came in. It's like they owned the IP to that algorithm, but then we would own the licensing rights in most cases because it was trained with the department data. So they could not go out there and just give that away or sell it to anybody else. That was in the contract because that was the goal. That was the crown jewel, was our data. To your point, I think it's probably higher than 80% of crap that's out there. It's hard to understand this today, but we had people driving a truck around and picking up video cassettes of tape to bring that tape in, clean it, get rid of the really bad stuff on it, get all the extra stuff off of the heads-up display, and then be able to train the model. That was excruciatingly difficult in those early days. Much better today than it used to be, but all of that was, where is the data? How well? People used to ask us, why didn't you go after the China threat first? We didn't have the data from China. We had data in the Middle East, and we had people in harm's way every single day in the Middle East, which is why we focused there. We had hundreds of thousands of hours of video. Now, take that into the day of frontier models. It's extremely concerning because these large tech companies are training the model basically on the world's data, the entire everything that's available in print, online, whatever. And they're not going to tell the government exactly what they trained it on. They're not going to give the source code. They're not going to give them the parameters they developed the model with. So what is the government's responsibility to bring that model in and then do their own independent assessment of it, to include red teaming it? Like, where does it break? The companies will say they did that themselves, and they will to a certain extent, but they're not working off the government's use cases. The government warfighting scenarios are so incredibly different from where those models were originally designed to do. There's a whole lot more that gets into it. And your point, I don't think enough people pay attention to the idea of data poisoning or corrupting models. Some of it you're not going to see. So you have to get sophisticated testing and evaluation to be able to find the possibility that these problems exist. But once you put it out in the wild, so to speak, I almost guarantee we're going to be surprised by some of the things we're going to see once it's out there in the wild.
Thinking about that for just a minute, but when you're talking about scooping things up, you're talking about battlefield digital evidence and electronic evidence. Troops retreat and things get dropped, phones, computers, whatever it may be. And that stuff historically is processed by the military at NMEC or someplace for sort of creating an intelligence picture of what is going on, and maybe for some sort of later forensic use by the military. But then what you're talking about is the feeding of these later models by all the vast data that they can get from anything that they can vacuum up over the internet. Well, one of the problems is, in my view, if something's going to be used to protect U.S. troops, and it's vacuuming up all sorts of rage data off of X and porn, we've learned. It's vacuuming up porn. And this is being used to create a model. A lot of us look at that and say, what in the name? I hope sincerely that this is effective, because it sounds insane and very dangerous.
I have grave concerns about what you just described, because we have seen examples where, let's just say, the CEO of XAI decided to change the parameters of his model, tweaked it a little bit, and it started spewing Nazi propaganda. And so he had to tweak the model back. This is no longer like humorous, right? These are being put into life or death situations. Who's doing that extra evaluation? I think it is incumbent upon the Pentagon to come up with governance. How do you actually govern these things? Can you use the model? What can you use it for? What must you not use it for? Who do you need to inform when you're going to use it for all these different things? I think we sort of have this idyllic vision of, oh, these are fantastic models. They can do anything. Well, anything in a military context is very different than anything at my house editing a document that I wrote. And I don't think we fully paid attention to the education and training of people. I'm beginning to hear more and more about, oh yeah, we have to take that on. And that's good. But the idea that we're already using these in combat as we speak gives me some pause, because things can go wrong with these models. We don't understand well enough what those really boundary conditions are. We're already seeing examples of how these models are cognitively influencing human beings. Like, they're shaping them in a way that you'll hear different phrases. One of them is automation bias. Humans end up placing undue confidence in machines and trusting the results when maybe they shouldn't. Now it's even gone a step further. This idea, which I find almost humorous, but it really is beginning to affect people, is cognitive surrender. Like, oh, look, this thing works. I'm going to believe in the results of it. And so I think these models are capable. We see the results in the research environment shaping people's understanding of the environment they're in ways that are not fully understood yet. And again, when you put them in national security context, is very different and a much more serious impact than we've ever seen before. So I think we ought to spend more time evaluating. Not to say I don't want to use them. I am all about experimenting with them. GenAI.mil stood up. That's great, fantastic. But I think we're seriously ought to be looking at who's using those for what reason. And if you hit a target that you shouldn't have hit, was AI involved in that? Was a large language model part of the problem? I don't know the answers to those yet. We ought to be digging deeper and deeper on how these are going to work in the real world.
Yeah, and for all I know, that may be happening, but it certainly hasn't bubbled to the surface that there's
No,
an
it
effort
hasn't.
at governance. What is bubbling to the surface is public reporting that every time some sort of standards need to be set for this AI and data protection and other things, that somebody tells the president that
Um,
he's going to lose out to China. And it is his job to make sure we don't lose out to China. And I know that he thinks that's part of his mandate, as it was for every president before him for the last, I guess, 30 years. Let me ask you this, though, because we're starting to talk a little bit about the data. And on the issue of data and targeting, though, I'm wondering, a guy like you, seeing what happened in the early days of Iran, assuming that's accurate reporting,
mhm.
that something reported to be a Palantir product was used in a targeting effort in Iran, and it hit an attended and busy girls' school. And not only did this cost, obviously, massive loss of life and injury, but you've got the loss of sort of global support for anything that the United
Mhm.
States is doing. I mean, the impact is immediate. Talk to me about, as you're thinking about these programs and you hear something like that, what did you think and what problems did you see that needed to be solved?
Well, first and foremost, absolute tragic what happened. There's no other word for it. It's tragic. And you can't be excused away as sort of the heat of battle. We do make mistakes in combat. And I've always said that no matter how good AI is, how advanced it is, it will never remove the friction and chaos and the horrors of warfare. And people who try to tell you it will make warfare more sterile are lying to you. It won't. I would like to believe that AI could be used in a way to help prevent that from happening or at least lower the risk of it happening. In this case, based on my very extensive background in targeting from every angle, from being fighter aviation to having responsibility for Air Force targeting squadrons that did this kind of targeting work, to being in the Pentagon as a three-star, trying to revive a moribund targeting profession. The first thing I thought about, and I believe it's probably the case, it was not AI related. It was a target that was in the database and either had more current imagery that did not get recognized for changes in that environment,
Mm.
and or there were additional sources of information, perhaps unclassified Google Street Map equivalent that would clearly have said girls' school. But how do you take in that additional information? So after saying this was a tragedy, my number two is, what is the command doing to minimize the risk of the same thing happening again? There are all sorts of things to be put in place of processes, policies, getting more expertise in. My guess is over 30 years of counterterrorism, we pulled a lot of that targeting expertise out of all the commands. And over time, it's atrophied. A skill set has atrophied, and nobody caught this. Why didn't they catch it? That is the single most important question. Put processes in place. I get frustrated when I hear just bragging about the number of targets that were hit, as opposed to asking a more germane question about why those targets. Are they the most important targets? Are they helping you achieve your desired political end state? Yes or no? Well, if the end state has changed a dozen times in the past few months, that becomes harder for crews to understand what are the right targets to hit. So there's an awful lot that gets wrapped up in this. We'll see what comes out in the investigation. I hope they make public the unclassified pieces of this. The American public does need to know, as you said, there is an international component of this, that people
Yeah.
need to have faith in the United States military that we're going to do the right things. And we're going to have to learn from this. And could AI have actually been more helpful as opposed to what we saw happen? I'd like to believe so, but we have to see the proof of this. You can't afford to do something like this and just brush it off and saying, well, that's warfare.
What do you think were your biggest takeaways from the time you spent working on these projects?
Beginning to change the culture of the department from a status quo to a recognition of this commercial technology world was moving at a pace. And some of us saw what we thought would play out in Ukraine is actually playing out. The pace of change is blistering. The idea of adaptability, agility, and ingenuity on the behalf of the Ukrainians it's really stunning to see it. We have to take away those lessons learned. That's one of the big things. I'd say the second one is, as much as I thought we could try to predict the future, we're horrible at it. The technology has changed so much in the intervening few years that the large language model has changed the game completely. So we saw some of it coming. Most important is probably the adaptability piece of it, the agility piece of it, but also understanding what are the processes to put in place so that we use the technology in ways that are ethical and responsible and predictable, and we have confidence in them. There's nothing wrong with saying those things. We've said them for hardware for 70 years in my military service. Why do we view this any differently? I think we're going to be surprised by a couple of things over the next few years. Emergent behaviors and cascading effects that we've never been able to duplicate in the simulated world, and they're going to surprise us in the real world because the adversary is always going to do something you never anticipated, and we're going to get surprised.
Do you want to make any predictions about where you think we're going to be on this in 20 years? Because 20 years is 100 years, right?
Yeah, I can. I would say I see the utopian scenario. I see the dystopian scenario. The part of me that I think we muddle along and we get better and better over time. But why we fight wars is never going to change. The how we fight wars will change radically between now and 20 years. Drones will be part of it, but I don't think they're going to be everything. There will be a lot more that we just don't understand yet. And I think it's time, as you said, you cannot claim in one breath, this is the most revolutionary technology the world has ever seen. And in the next breath say, but we can't regulate it. It will stifle innovation. We're beyond that point. There has to be a smart regulatory approach to doing this. And I don't know what that looks like right now, but there's some people on the Hill that are going to ask really difficult questions in the next 2 years before the 2028 election about how to get this right.
What advice would you give the people who are still working on these programs or the next iteration of them in the Pentagon and the private sector?
We need closer government, industry, academia relationships. This idea of going back to what you said at the beginning, Eisenhower public-private partnerships. We got away from that for a lot of different reasons at the end of the Cold War. We need to bring that back. Everybody's got a different motivation. I'm not going to pull the Patriot card just because I think it's in the nation's best interest to work closer together and to get a shared understanding. What I'm a little frustrated now by the Pentagon is not having this conversation with the American people more about what I learned from Google and Project Maven was we got a transparency problem on all sides. We need to be very open about how these things are going to affect society, broadly speaking, jobs, but also how we fight and win or lose wars. So I think it just needs to be a conversation. And if people can't serve in the military or don't want to serve in the military, go into a company that's working on national security things. And I think you'll find a sense of purpose in a mission that otherwise you might not find in just the pure commercial world of technology.
All right. Well, I'm really glad you came in, but now I know about 5 other podcasts that I would like to have with you and many other discussions. And I hope in the future, given how much we're covering AI right now, that you'll come back and visit with us.
I'd love to do it anytime, Lisa. Really a great conversation. I enjoyed it. There's so much to talk about. And I think there's a thirst for it in the country right now. It's like, hey, tell us what you're doing with our taxpayer money. That's a valid question or thing to answer. So yes, happy to come back at any time.
All right. Well, it's been great to talk to you tonight. Our guest tonight has been Jack Shanahan, who was the inaugural director of the U.S. Department of Defense Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon. Like and share this episode with a friend who values civil discussion, facts over clickbait and shouting. The writer and producer and host of NSLT is me, Elisa Poteet. I'm always here in my individual capacity. Our editor, my co-producer, is Francis Burkham. The tireless and amazing Holly Wigman, lurking in the background even as I'm speaking, is also co-producer of this cast. Our program manager is the ever lovely and fun Antasia Hawkins-Blakeney. Social media and research support comes from Alana Coopersmith. And of course, we can never forget the brilliant minds of the members of the Standing Committee on Law and National Security, because without them, we wouldn't really have this podcast. But let me remind you, since we're talking about service and duty and responsibility, these people do pursue the good in the interest of national security without regard for politics. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.
The views expressed on national security law today have not been approved by the House of Delegates or the Board of Governors of the American Bar Association, and this recording should not be construed as representing ABA policy.